good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. So listen, depending on what part of the day it is, hopefully that greeting addressed all of those concerned. Today what we're going to be going over is the 5.4, the first cell. We just finished up with the 5.3 about the first organic molecules. Please go ahead and do those review questions that are on your notes so that we can be prepared to discuss those whenever we return. So, the first cell. Now, if you remember, there are two types of cells. There are prokaryotic cells, which lack a nucleus and lack membrane-bound organelles, and there's eukaryotic cells, which have a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about both, and specifically how they kind of came about from the hypothetical region when we talk about kind of the first cell generation within biology. So we're going to learn how organic molecules could have formed the first cell. We'll learn about LUCA, L-U-C-A, that's an acronym for the last universal common ancestor. And we'll learn a little bit about how photosynthesis developed and then led to the development of cellular respiration. Now, if you remember from kind of when we talked about photosynthesis and cellular respiration, those are two biochemical processes that are interrelated, right? The equation for photosynthesis is the same forwards as cellular respiration is backwards, so on and so forth. If you remember those equations, great. Something that you definitely know for the future. Also, I am going to gift you with, at every slide, there will be a science joke afterwards. So for this slide, it is, what did one tectonic plate say when he bumped into the other? Sorry, my fault. Spelled F-A-U-L-T. Get it? All right, so how do you make a complex cell? Essentially, this starts out with very, very simplistic organic molecules coming together in such a way that a cell is formed. Now, if you kind of go back and think about what are the key components of cells, all cells, they're going to have a cell membrane, they're going to have cytoplasm, they're going to have some type of genetic material, they'll have ribosomes, and they'll have a cytoskeleton. So when we talk about the first cell, specifically ones that are a bit more complex, they're going to have these 5 key components to them. So the first cell involved the development of a membrane surrounding organic molecules such as RNA. Now, if you remember when we talked about RNA, that's that RNA world hypothesis where RNA has the unique ability to do 2 things. 1, store genetic information, and 2, serve as kind of an enzymatic function so it can manage chemical reactions to make sure they happen on time and in the right scenario. Scientists speculate that lipid membranes screw around organic molecules to create a barrier. So thinking back to kind of the structure of the cell, that lipid membrane was called a phospholipid bilayer, having 2 layers of phospholipids. The hydrophilic heads are on the outside, the hydrophobic tails are on the interior. And then these membranes helped maintain homeostasis, that maintenance of an internal condition, and it prevented reactions with other molecules, stopping the formation of new compounds or the degradation of the necessary compounds of that cell, for example, RNA, which housed the genetic material, as well as served as an enzymatic function to maintain reactions. That allowed these organic molecules to persist, possibly leading to the formation of the first cells. The first cells are able to live, reproduce, pass genetic information, and they could be considered the first living organisms. So we can kind of think back to towards the beginning of the year when we talked about the characteristics of life. Remember, the cell is the basic component of all living things, or the basic unit of life. Things must be able to interact with their environment, reproduce, pass on genetic information, have complex chemistry, as well as break down molecules for energy. What did the biologist wear to impress his date? Joke number 2, designer jeans. Not jeans, J-E-A-N-S, jeans, G-E-N-E-S. You're welcome, ladies and gentlemen. All right, so if you look at this picture, this is the hypothetical structure of the first cell. Again, RNA is going to be both that genetic material and serve as that kind of enzymatic function, letting chemical reactions take place. The membrane is going to be that lipid membrane. As you can see there, that's that phospholipid bilayer we talked about, where we've got our hydrophilic heads on the outside and the interior. of the bilayer, and then we have the hydrophobic tails along the inside. Again, this consisted of RNA enclosed with a lipid membrane. This is a pretty simple structure, and it had no additional organelles. This means that the first cell was probably closer from a structural standpoint to prokaryotes than it is eukaryotes, because it didn't have any organelles, obviously. All right, last universal common ancestor, abbreviated LUCA. This refers to a single cell or group of cells that are a common ancestor to all life on Earth. So from a biology perspective, the theory is that everything that we see today that is made up of a cell had this cell or group of cells as the common ancestor, meaning the great times 10 to the 8th power grandparent of the cells we see today. It existed about 3.5 billion years ago, estimated, and considered one of the earliest prokaryotic cells. It lacked a nucleus and other membrane-bound organelles, and it marks the beginning of the complex tree of life. And that tree of life is just basically the kind of the family tree of all life, if you catch what I mean. All right, photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Again, these are two integral biochemical processes to all life on Earth that are the opposites of each other. So photosynthesis is 6CO2 plus 6H2O yields C6H12O6 plus 6O2. Cellular respiration is going to be the opposite of that. C6H12O6 plus 6O2 yields 6H2O plus 6CO2. The earliest cells were likely heterotrophs, getting energy from other molecules in the organic soup that made up early Earth. Now, if you remember, when we kind of talked about the presence of the atmosphere on early Earth, it lacked oxygen. What that means is these things could not go under cellular respiration initially. They had to rely on other metabolic processes, such as fermentation, to get their ATP energy from these organic molecules. And if you remember, kind of that fermentation only made around 2 ATP total, or net, we should say, per organic molecule, specifically glucose. Whereas if they could undergo cellular respiration, it made anywhere from 34 to 38, depending on the scenario. So with the advent of oxygen, we saw a much more efficient utilization of organic molecules as a source of energy. Photosynthesis developed about 3 billion years ago, making a new way for organisms to harness energy. This was extremely beneficial to those organisms that could do this. Instead of having to go out and find food or have these cells find other organic molecules to break down for energy, they can make organic molecules from inorganic molecules just using energy from the sunlight. Now, another big piece of this is once photosynthesis was developed, if you remember that equation, one of the byproducts is oxygen, which then would later give kind of that reactant piece for the cellular respiration equation. So the first autotrophs could create food from carbon dioxide and water using sunlight, and gave nourishment to them and other organisms. Once it became more widespread, there was enough oxygen in the atmosphere, so much so that it led to what's called the oxygen catastrophe. So essentially the theory behind this is that once these photosynthetic organisms came about, they were so much more efficient and they grew much faster and at a higher rate than all the other cells or whatnot, meaning you got a lot of oxygen production because these cells were a little bit more advantageous. They could make their own food versus having to go find it. What this led to is an overproduction of oxygen. Now, because cellular respiration at this time hadn't come about, there was no way to create an equilibrium of oxygen in the atmosphere, and so you just saw oxygen levels increase and increase and increase and increase. And essentially, because the atmosphere at the time didn't have oxygen, once oxygen started getting introduced, what essentially we saw is that a lot of the organisms alive during that time, oxygen was toxic to them, which led to the death of a lot of these organisms, and thus the term oxygen catastrophe. There were a few surviving cells that developed cellular respiration to use this oxygen in cellular respiration to be a little bit more efficient in terms of energy utilization. And it gave them a much better advantage in this new oxygen-rich environment versus other cells that couldn't utilize oxygen. So in summary, the first cells consisted of a little more than organic molecules such as RNA inside a lipid membrane. One cell or group of cells called the last universal common ancestor, LUCA, gave rise to all subsequent life on Earth. And photosynthesis came about and released oxygen into the atmosphere, creating that oxygen catastrophe. And then cellular respiration evolved after that to make use of the oxygen. All right, I think we should have enough time to watch this little video on LUCA.
Billions of years ago, on the young planet Earth, simple organic compounds assembled into more complex coalitions that could grow and reproduce. They were the very first life on Earth, and they gave rise to every one of the billions of species that have inhabited our planet since. At the time, Earth was almost completely devoid of what we'd recognize as a suitable environment for living things. The young planet had widespread volcanic activity and an atmosphere that created hostile conditions. So where on Earth could life begin? To begin the search for the cradle of life, it's important to first understand the basic necessities for any life form. Elements and compounds essential to life include hydrogen, methane, nitrogen, carbon dioxide, phosphates, and ammonia. In order for these ingredients to commingle and react with each other, they need a liquid solvent, water. And in order to grow and reproduce, all life needs a source of energy. Life forms are divided into two camps: autotrophs, like plants, that generate their own energy, and heterotrophs, like animals, that consume other organisms for energy. The first life form wouldn't have had other organisms to consume, of course, so it must have been an autotroph, generating energy either from the sun or from chemical gradients. So what locations meet these criteria? Places on land or close to the surface of the ocean have the advantage of access to sunlight. But at the time when life began, the UV radiation on Earth's surface was likely too harsh for life to survive there. One setting offers protection from this radiation and an alternative energy source: the hydrothermal vents that wind across the ocean floor, covered by kilometers of seawater and bathed in complete darkness. A hydrothermal vent is a fissure in the Earth's crust where seawater seeps into magma chambers and is ejected back out at high temperatures, along with a rich slurry of minerals and simple chemical compounds. Energy is particularly concentrated at the steep chemical gradients of hydrothermal vents. There's another line of evidence that points to hydrothermal vents: the last universal common ancestor of life, or LUCA for short. LUCA wasn't the first life form, but it's as far back as we can trace. Even so, we don't actually know what LUCA looked like. There's no LUCA fossil, no modern-day LUCA still around. Instead, scientists identified genes that are commonly found in species across all three domains of life that exist today. Since these genes are shared across species and domains, they must have been inherited from a common ancestor. These shared genes tell us that LUCA lived in a hot, oxygen-free place and harvested energy from a chemical gradient, like the ones at hydrothermal vents. There are two kinds of hydrothermal vent: black smokers and white smokers. Black smokers release acidic, carbon dioxide-rich water, heated to hundreds of degrees Celsius and packed with sulfur, iron, copper, and other metals essential to life. But scientists now believe that black smokers were too hot for LUCA, so now the top candidates for the cradle of life are white smokers. Among the white smokers, a field of hydrothermal vents on the mid-Atlantic ridge called Lost City has become the most favored candidate for the cradle of life. The seawater expelled here is highly alkaline and lacks carbon dioxide, but is rich in methane and offers more hospitable temperatures. Adjacent black smokers may have contributed the carbon dioxide necessary for life to evolve at Lost City. giving it all the components to support the first organisms that radiated into the incredible diversity of life on Earth today. Did you know that a single-celled organism caused the first mass extinction? Check out this animation about how it almost wiped out life on Earth and paved the way for complex life.
How are we doing on time? We can go ahead and watch this video too.
There's an organism that changed the world. It caused both the first mass extinction in Earth's history and also paved the way for complex life. How? By sending the first free oxygen molecules into our atmosphere. And they did all this as single-celled life forms. They're cyanobacteria, and the story of these simple organisms that don't even have nuclei or any other organelles is a pivotal chapter in the story of life on Earth. Earth's atmosphere wasn't always the oxygen-rich mixture we breathe today. 3.5 billion years ago, the atmosphere was mostly nitrogen, carbon dioxide, and methane. Almost all oxygen was locked up in molecules like water, not floating around in the air. The oceans were populated by anaerobic microbes. Those are simple unicellular life forms that thrive without oxygen and get energy by scavenging what molecules they find. But somewhere between 2.5 and 3.5 billion years ago, one of these microbial species, probably floating on the surface of the ocean, evolved a new ability: photosynthesis. Structures in their cell membrane could harness the energy from sunlight to turn carbon dioxide and water into oxygen gas and sugars, which they could use for energy. Those organisms were the ancestors of what we now call cyanobacteria. Their bluish color comes from the blue-green pigments that capture the sunlight they need. Photosynthesis gave those ancient bacteria a huge advantage over other species. They could now produce their own energy from an almost endless supply of raw ingredients. So their populations exploded, and they started polluting the atmosphere with a new waste product: oxygen. At first, the trickle of extra oxygen was soaked up by chemical reactions with iron or decomposing cells. But after a few 100 million years, the cyanobacteria were producing oxygen faster than it could be absorbed, and the gas started building up in the atmosphere. That was a big problem for the rest of Earth's inhabitants. Oxygen-rich air was actually toxic to them. The result, about 2.5 billion years ago, was a mass extinction of virtually all life on Earth, which barely spared the cyanobacteria. Geologists call this the Great Oxygenation Event, or even the oxygen catastrophe.
If you remember from when we were discussing these notes, they referred to it as the oxygen catastrophe, where again, those bacteria that could photosynthesize released enough oxygen into the atmosphere that it pretty much killed everything off.
That wasn't the only problem. Methane had been acting as a potent greenhouse gas that kept the Earth warm. But now, the extra oxygen reacted with methane to form carbon dioxide and water, which don't trap as much heat. The thinner atmospheric blanket caused Earth's first, and possibly longest, ice age, the Huronian glaciation. The planet was basically one giant snowball for several 100 million years. Eventually, life adjusted. Aerobic organisms, which can use oxygen for energy, started sopping up some of the excess gas in the atmosphere. The oxygen concentration rose and fell until eventually it reached the approximate 21% we have today. And being able to use the chemical energy in oxygen gave organisms the boost they needed to diversify and evolve more complex forms. Cyanobacteria had a part to play in that story, too. Hundreds of millions of years ago, some other prehistoric microbe swallowed a cyanobacterium whole in a process called endosymbiosis. In doing so, that microbe acquired its own internal photosynthesis factory. This was the ancestor of plant cells.
The theory that they're going over here right now is called the endosymbiotic theory. We'll actually get on it and discuss it here in this next section. Here in about 5 minutes, we'll go a little bit more into depth about how those first eukaryotic cells theoretically formed.
And cyanobacteria became chloroplasts, the organelles that carry out photosynthesis today. Cyanobacteria are still around in almost every environment on Earth: oceans, fresh water, soil, Antarctic rocks, sloth fur. They still pump oxygen into the atmosphere, and they also pull nitrogen out to fertilize the plants they helped create. We wouldn't recognize life on Earth without them, but also thanks to them, we almost didn't have life on Earth at all.
I think this video is a little bit longer. Yeah, it's around
Thanks
7
to
minutes. If we have time when we get back to actual school, we can kind of watch this one as you're either doing review questions or have time at the end of the hour, etc.
Brilliant. Thanks to brilliant.
All right, any questions? If you do, shoot me an email if you have questions. Be happy to answer them. Now, time for a biology joke. Let's see what it's up here. What type of fish is made out of 2 sodium atoms? Tuna. The number 2 and then letters Na as in the abbreviation chemical symbol for sodium. You're welcome. All right, eukaryotic evolution. This is kind of discussing or getting a little bit more in depth. We talked about in that video where these first eukaryotic cells formed, cyanobacteria became chloroplast, and then small prokaryotes that were really good at cell respiration became mitochondria. So if anyone's ever seen Nemo, you see that symbiotic relationship with a clownfish live in the anemone, and essentially the anemone is a protective kind of shelter for them, so that they are benefited from predation, making it safer for them. And this is called symbiosis. It's basically 2 organisms living in conjunction with each other so that either one benefits or the other benefits, and sometimes they both benefit. Now this is important because when we start talking about these eukaryotic cells as they develop, they're really functionally just what is called a mutualistic relationship between a large prokaryotic cell and small specialized prokaryotic cells that were either really good at photosynthesis or really good at cellular respiration. So kind of take a step back, we'll talk about eukaryotic cells. These contain chromosomes and a nuclear membrane, mitochondria for ATP production, flagella for movement, and chloroplast for photosynthesis. The textbook definition of eukaryotic cells are ones that have a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. Some examples of membrane-bound organelles are listed here at this figure to the right, such as the mitochondria, Golgi apparatus, vesicles, endoplasmic reticulum, cell membrane, etc. Okay, and then down here, we've got the prokaryotic cells, which will usually be bacteria. They're going to be simpler and smaller. All right, so the emergence of eukaryotes. The first eukaryotic cells were estimated to evolve about 2 billion years ago from this process called the endosymbiotic theory, which explains the evolution of eukaryotic cells, where large cells engulfed smaller ones. So if you look at this figure at the bottom, you see a large prokaryotic cell. You'll see the cell membrane start to enfold. This enfolding is hypothesized to create a nucleus. Remember, that's where the DNA is going to be held. After the nucleus, you see this large prokaryotic cell engulf either cyanobacterium or aerobic bacterium. The aerobic, remember, that means it can use air, specifically oxygen. So this is going to be something that can utilize oxygen to carry out cellular respiration to make a lot of ATP. And the cyanobacterium is really good at photosynthesis. And then that would eventually lead to the ancestral eukaryotes. So large cells ingested but did not digest smaller cells. These smaller cells evolved into organelles, but the large and the small cells benefited from this arrangement. Essentially, the small cells had protection from predators, and then the large cells were able to get either the energy from the mitochondria or the food from the cyanobacteria that could photosynthesize. So the small cells breaking down waste evolved into mitochondria. Small cells using sunlight for food evolved into chloroplasts. When you look at your book, this is the visual that it gives. Large prokaryotic cell engulfs a small prokaryotic cell. Small prokaryotic cell lives inside the larger one, kind of like the clownfish living inside the anemone. Both cells benefit from their arrangement, and these small cells are passed on from generation to generation. So one thing we've kind of talked about when we look at the specific organelle mitochondria with our human cells, mitochondria have their own DNA, which is separate from the DNA that you have in your genome. What this kind of means from a heredity perspective is most of your genes you get half from your father, half from your mother. The mitochondria are all inherited from the mother, and they are carried on through that egg that your mother has. And so you will have your mother's mitochondria. And these are going to divide separately from the rest of the cell, and they undergo actually binary fission similar to those prokaryotic cells. This is just a little bit more integrated and in-depth look at it. You see the ancestral prokaryote kind of grow. Plasma membrane folds in to make a nucleus, and some of these other interior organelles, such as endoplasmic reticulum or Golgi body, it'll engulf these aerobic bacteria that can undergo cellular respiration to make a lot of ATP. These would lead into the ancestral heterotrophic eukaryotes or animal cells. However, if they also engulfed or ate photosynthetic bacteria, those cyanobacteria, they would lead to the ancestral photosynthetic eukaryote, kind of the precursor to plant cells. So why do we think this happened, or why do scientists think this happened? Part of it is because mitochondria and chloroplasts share features of prokaryotic cells. Their DNA is short and circular. It is not organized into chromosomes, and it's distinct from the other cell DNA. Their membrane composition is similar to prokaryotes, and is different than eukaryotic cells. Also, the ribosomes within the mitochondria, since they make their own proteins within the mitochondria, they are more like bacterial ribosomes, and then they reproduce by binary fission, not mitosis. Also, the chemical pathways inside of them are closer to prokaryotes as well, and they're also enclosed by 2 or more membranes. If you look at this last bullet point here, the reason they're closed by 2 or more membranes is because whenever these cells kind of ingest them, they'll have the cell membrane of the bacteria that is being ingested, and then when they ingest them, the larger cell will basically create another membrane outside of it. That is why they will have a double membrane. So as you can see for this figure, there's a lot of similarities between mitochondria and chloroplast. This is kind of owing to the theoretical relationship between them, having both come from prokaryotes, being engulfed by larger cells. See the double membrane, outer membrane, and inner membrane, as well as the outer and inner membranes within the chloroplast. All right, so that ancestral kind of prokaryotic cell, we think it has more in common and more similarities with archaea. This is because the oldest related eukaryote is red algae. And this kind of established in bacteria, archaea, and eukaryotes as the different domains. And so kind of the precursor to modern eukaryotic cells isn't necessarily going to be more closely related to bacteria. It'll be this other domain, which is archaea. So visually, if you look, when we talk about kind of phylogenetics and cladistics, you'll see kind of a tree of life, and you'll see where the split off point kind of happened, or theoretically happened. Now, as cells got a lot more energy, they got bigger, they allowed them to specialize, specifically given their large size. If you think about all the cells in our body, they have all of the exact same DNA, whether that's the cells in your brain making neurons or in the cells on the inner of your stomach helping you digest food. They all contain the same DNA. They're just specialized for function based on where they're at, right? This specialization allowed to the evolution or the development of animals, plants, and fungi, larger and more complex organisms. This is important because diversity and complexity of single cells and microorganisms led to these more complex organisms. All right, so when we talk about the human connection between kind of simpler organisms like bacteria and then more complex organisms like us, we see symbiosis, kind of relationships between two different species, not just when we talk about mitochondria and chloroplast in eukaryotic cells, but also because humans actually have more bacteria cells than human cells. We have them all over our body. We have them in our digestive system. We have them in our respiratory system as well. And most of the times they help us out. We say that they take up real estate. And so it's usually bacteria that's not going to really cause us any issues. And what they do is they basically take up all the space so any bad bacteria can't cause infections. This kind of also points to a shared history among mitochondria, bacteria, and humans. As I was talking about earlier, we talked about that phylogenetic tree of life. You see here Archaea in red branches off a little bit closer to the eukaryota, kind of indicating that the common ancestor between these two different domains was more likely an Archaea than it was a bacteria. So we've got the domains, bacteria, Archaea, and eukaryotes. Eukaryotes are closer to Archaea, so the organelles likely descended from bacteria, but that larger prokaryotic cell that engulfed the smaller prokaryotic cells was probably Archaea. All right, so in summary, eukaryotic evolution occurred about 2 billion years ago, explained by the endosymbiotic theory, where a large prokaryotic cell engulfed but did not digest small prokaryotic cells that were specialized for a certain function, either cellular respiration or photosynthesis. And this paved the way for a wide variety of eukaryotic life forms existing today as well. All right, any questions? Nope. All right, I think that is it for this section. Thank you very much. And if you want extra credit, this is what I'm going to do. So if you want extra credit, send me the funniest science meme you can by email by 3:25 on Tuesday the 16th. Here's the deal. There's 100 extra points up for grabs. And essentially, the fewer people that email me the memes saying that they, basically meaning that they listen to this presentation, then the more extra credit there will be. So I'm putting 100 points out there. If one person emails me, that person gets the 100 points. If 2 people email me, they each get 50, so on and so forth. So the more people that email me, the fewer extra credit points. So there is an incentive for you to not go and tell everybody about the extra credit for those of them that either didn't listen to this during the virtual day or just wrote down the stuff on the slides instead of listening to the entire presentation. Alrighty. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have. I'll try to be responsive as possible.